Good morning, guys. Happy Monday, and welcome to the podcast. I've got a fantastic guest for you today coming out of Tennessee, Dr. Joe Nounou, goes by Joe, and he is a physician turned innovator, and he's going to talk to us all about his work, what he does, and I'm really happy to have him on. He's also got an MBA as well, and really happy to add value to the audience. So, Joe, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for having me.
Yeah. Briefly introduce yourself and we'll dive into the conversation.
Fantastic. I'm an anesthesiologist by training, finished my anesthesia residency in 2009, and worked in full-time clinical practice until about 21, till spring of 21. In about 2020, I started working on getting my MBA because there were deficiencies in our clinical practice that I wanted to help address. Turns out that graduating from medical school with an MD does not make you a great businessman necessarily. And also wanted to have the tools needed to bring a new perspective and an improvement to the way we treat this epidemic. So got my MBA and left full-time clinical practice in 21 to begin this mission.
Yeah, I really love that. And so, we'll start off and, first thing talking about is what inspired you to transition from practicing as a anesthesiologist to becoming an innovator, particularly on emergency medication for the opioid epidemic?
Great question, Chris. So it was basically noticing the incredible increase in the overdose deaths that began. I mean, it's been increasing for years, but starting about 2017, I started noticing it. It looks like the fentanyl was a major contributor when it hit the streets in 2015. 2017, I want to say that the overdose deaths were on the order of 50, 60,000. A few years later, it was up to 100,000 lives per year. So that's basically 300 people a day. And with my experience and my background in anesthesiology, I had this idea that there was something different that we could do because clearly Narcan was um, not the solution that was going to bring us one step closer to eliminating these overdose deaths. So COVID hit, our clinical practice was struggling, some management issues, business decisions, and I'd always made the excuse of, well, I've got a good job, I've got kids, I can't leave a full-time job to go chase this wild goose. And I've heard it termed golden handcuffs, and I suspect a lot of folks in your audience are in a similar position. You make a good living, but fortunately for me, when COVID hit, the income declined enough, and also the opioid epidemic was high enough and severe enough that it no longer made sense for me to ignore the potential benefit that I could offer to our community. So I made the decision to take that leap and begin exploring what a novel solution to drug overdose and really respiratory arrest in general. We've talked a lot about, we mentioned drug overdose, but the reality is this is a medication that would treat all causes of respiratory arrest, potentially drowning, cardiac arrest, and other causes. So this is a very wide servicing medication that we're starting with drug overdose indications, but there's also other potential.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And, there's you and me, we share this kind of same, story around this kind of working in the healthcare industrial complex. So talk about, because you did the ResPen development, and walk us through the development process of what are the biggest phases, particularly regulatory, in creating a device intended for non-medical personnel.
So the first step that I needed to um, successfully complete was finding a way that we could take the active ingredient of ResPen and apply it to the drug overdose market, the indication. So the medication was actually first approved by the FDA back in the 60s, but unfortunately it was designed to be given IV, kicks in very quickly, but also wears off, excuse me, also wears off very quickly. And for our purposes, we wanted this medication to be delivered intravenously, sorry, intramuscularly by anybody, non-medically trained bystanders, and be effective for 30 minutes. Now, that number came from basically market research we did. We interviewed a number of people that would be end users. So that includes everyone from first responders, professionals, to families of folks with substance abuse disorder, and even folks with substance abuse disorder themselves. So the first thing we had to do was make sure that this medication was going to be effective intramuscularly. And that was really a big part of the work that we did. We looked at what medications we would be compatible if we were to combine things in a syringe together so they don't form a precipitate. We wanted to know that the medication could be delivered via emergency auto injector, a lot like the EpiPen is. And that, that's what's taken up a lot of the time over the last 4 years. So we had to prove that this medication was going to work, the new formulation was going to be effective, and that's so a lot of it was basic science initially. As far as the regulatory part of things, we're really just diving into that now. We've engaged the FDA. The first step in getting a medication through the drug approval process is what you call pre-IND. So pre meaning before, IND, investigational new drug. So this medication, as it is a reformulation, can go through a much shorter, quicker pathway. So the FDA has special cutouts for medications of this variety. And also because of the tremendous need for it and the tremendous safety profile this medication has, it qualifies or likely will qualify for the fast track designation. So we are in a process of beginning the FDA's regulatory process. And this is something that could happen in as short as 2 to 3 years. But there's still a lot of work to be done, just to be clear on that.
Yeah, really interesting. And so, moving the conversation along, um, this this idea of where you have this opioid crisis response, and how does ResPen fit into the larger conversation around the opioid epidemic, and what potential does it have to change outcomes for overdose patients?
I love that question, Chris, because that's really a target focus of the work that we've been doing. The current methods we have for treating acute overdoses, which is very commonly either non-opioid based or it's high dose fentanyl overdoses. And both of those types of overdoses are poorly treated with naloxone, commonly known as Narcan. There's a new medication that just got approved a year or so ago called Opvi, and it's another opiate blocker. It works, supposedly works longer than Narcan, so it doesn't wear off as fast, but there's no indication that it's actually more potent. So the potency is really the issue. When folks overdose on fentanyl, they may be overdosing on 5, 6, 10 times a dose that would otherwise be fatal. And the the naloxone, first of all, the nasal spray you only give it once every 2 minutes because it takes time to absorb it into the nasal mucosa and through the tissue and the lining of the nose. The second thing is it often takes many doses to reverse the massive doses of opiates. So talking to first responders, it's not uncommon for them to give more than 10 doses of Narcan nasal spray. Well, if you do the math on that, they're getting Narcan nasal spray, not breathing for a good 15 to 20 minutes. The problem there is the brain starts dying in 5 minutes. So we knew that whatever we were going to do, it was going to have to deliver an effective respiratory result in a shorter period of time. And that's what goes into a lot of the work that we've done. Additionally, the newest medicate or drug that's on the street that's causing respiratory arrest and depression is basically animal tranquilizers or animal anesthetics that's used in veterinary medicine. The chemical name for it is xylazine, known on the streets colloquially as trank. Talking to somebody who's basically boots on the ground in Philadelphia, she tells me that virtually all their overdoses that they're seeing where somebody quits breathing is due to this veterinarian used anesthetic. It's not fentanyl anymore. So that's a scary thing because it's not an opiate, it no longer is effectively, it cannot be effectively treated with Narcan, with naloxone. So this medication we developed doesn't only work against individual drugs, it actually works specifically in the body's naturally occurring respiratory centers to trigger those signals in the respiratory circuitry to make the person breathe, regardless of the cause of respiratory arrest. We like this because it affects, it basically makes somebody breathe for whatever, over whatever drug overdose they were experiencing. And in fact, like I mentioned, also for other causes of respiratory arrest, like cardiac arrest or drowning, it basically just stimulates the brain to breathe.
Interesting. And the next question I have for you is with this idea of these healthcare solutions. Also, another broader question is, with your innovations, what are the broader implications for healthcare delivery, particularly in emergency or critical care situations?
So the broad implication that I see it is that this is a medication that might be used um, in the wards. It might be used anytime a healthcare worker encounters a patient who's non-responsive, who's experiencing inadequate or non no, or nil respiratory function. So the number one cause of respiratory arrest, especially, sorry, of a cardiac arrest in a hospital, is actually respiratory arrest. Oftentimes, a nurse will go into a patient's room, try to stimulate a patient, and find that they're not breathing or breathing very shallow, and they're on the verge of respiratory arrest. So the way I envision this is that the discovering nurse will alert the code team, the folks who will respond to this emergency by hitting the code blue button, usually in the rooms, and they would get the crash cart, which is basically it's a toolbox full of all the medications and equipment they would need to resuscitate somebody in an emergency. And the very first thing they would give would be this respiratory stimulant, with the expectation that as soon as somebody receives this medication and that stimulates breathing, that might be enough to actually save their life so that they don't actually go into cardiac arrest. The other potential benefit of this is to keep it in those lock boxes in public places, the way they do the AEDs, the automatic external defibrillator devices. And these are basically electronic boxes that are placed onto somebody's chest when they, they collapse in public, in case they have a shockable rhythm. We teach CPR, and a lot of people have learned how to resuscitate people in public, but it's also no longer taught to give rescue breaths, because that's a really hard skill to teach effectively. And then people don't want to be exposed to potential infectious materials that might be associated with that person. So somebody goes down, you hook them up to the AED, you give them an IM injection with this auto injector, again, much like an EpiPen, and so that this medication manages the breathing while the AED manages shocking the patient. So it's really a good way to improve outcomes as far as increasing oxygenation and breathing for these folks that are either in cardiac arrest or impending cardiac arrest.
Yeah, I think the audience really can garner the informative value of. So the next question I have for you is, we were talking earlier. You were talking how med school doesn't prepared you well for the business world. And so, how has your MBA influenced your approach to pharmaceutical innovation, especially in terms of bringing a product to market?
It's a great question. The biggest thing that I got out of my business education was kind of seeing the multiple facets involved in running a business effectively. Oftentimes, it's not a complex thing. Business is really very simple, and but it's also deceivingly so. So a well-run business involves addressing a market need, doing appropriate market research, um, and is really good at um, addressing, anticipating the um, the pitfalls in business planning, um, and a lot of that is anticipating what the costs are going to be, what your revenues are going to be, and that helps you make go no go decisions. So with what I've been doing with this pharmaceutical venture is that I've been really exploring how to make this venture successful. Unfortunately, the reality is that in order to have a successful anything that requires investors, you're going to have to entice investors with a return on their investment. So most people out there are not charity. They're not charities. They're not willing to fork over the tens of millions of dollars needed just to feel good. They're going to want to get something in return. And making sure that those investors' needs are met so that they're willing to invest. And at the same time, you're able to deliver a medication that's still affordable for people involves making some very strategic business decisions and understanding how day-to-day decisions in the development of this medication and the development of this process is actually going to impact the cost of this medication down the road. And when you do those things carefully, you can deliver a medication at an affordable cost rather than some of these ridiculously overpriced drugs that we're seeing that insurance companies oftentimes won't cover and people can't afford on their own. So, really, I'd say the business perspective allowed me to appropriately plan and develop an effective strategy in bringing this medication as far as we have. And of course, we still have a ways to go, but I think we've largely covered the biggest hurdles just by it's basically got us to where we are to in a cost effective way.
Yeah. Another follow-up question I have for you is a lot of doctors, they listen to this podcast. They're doctors, they're clinicians, and they a common theme is they think that clinical medicine is the pinnacle, and if you do other things such as physician entrepreneurship or investments, it's kind of so. How do you address this idea among clinicians that clinical medicine is the only thing or it's the gold standard? And those that interested in physician entrepreneurship, but they have this stigma around entrepreneurs and innovation.
So by definition, all physicians are in business, like it or not. They're either owners of their practice or part owners of their practice, or they're employed by a hospital who, and they're the ones who are producing the product. So orthopedic surgeon, they're producing RVUs. They are they're creating revenue generation for the hospital, but effectively they're in business for themselves. So if somebody is against physician entrepreneurship, then this isn't for them. And honestly, this isn't necessarily for probably most people. Most people don't have the desire um, and the risk tolerance to jump out of a steady clinical position to branch out into something that's completely unknown. An analogy that I've used to share this with people who've asked me similar questions is it's a lot like skydiving. If you've ever jumped out of an airplane, those first few seconds you leave that aircraft, you're gasping. You're like, "What did I do?" And the reality is, um, there's a lot of that kind of sensation, um, metaphorically, of course, when you leave clinical practice to pursue something that that is largely an unknown. The ultimate deciding factor that I would like to leave um, with your audience is, what do you want out of life? If somebody is very happy going to work, a lot of physicians have a uh, a very set schedule, a 9 to 5. You come in, you clock out, so to speak, and you see your patients. You have to meet certain metrics, but you collect your paycheck. And if that's what you want, great. Do what makes you happy. But there are a lot of people who want more, or feel like they can do more, or they're burned out. They're frustrated. They feel like they're cogs in a machine that they have no control over. They are meeting requirements by their board, by the hospital, licensing not agencies, licensing departments, like medical licensing folks for the state. And all they're trying to do is help people and take care of people. And another point, as I'm answering, this question in somewhat of a long-winded fashion, but this is important. We end up working to um, we're working more and more for basically the same pay. Anesthesiologists in Northeast Tennessee make basically the same amount they made in 1992, despite working a lot more, seeing more patients, doing more blocks, more procedures, and that doesn't even account for inflation. So if you want to get out of that, the first thing you have to do is trust yourself, be willing to get rid of those golden handcuffs, be willing to make sacrifices. Um, be frugal for a minute, take your money and put it somewhere that it can start working for you. For some people, that's real estate. For some people, that's starting a medically related business. Um, but it's about leveraging your time. If you are looking to generate more income, rather than working harder, work smarter. And that's basically by reaching a larger audience. So where uh, somebody might say, okay, well, as an anesthesiologist, I can see extra patients and I can, or work extra shifts. Well, you're still limited by the number of hours in the day. But if, as an anesthesiologist, you say, okay, well, I can help all these extra anesthesia groups become more productive, more efficient, generate more revenue themselves, and I just take a small piece of that, you've now leveraged your time across multiple different platforms of revenue generating sources. So I would tell people, if it's not for you, don't do it. But if it is for you, think about how you can leverage your time, and don't be afraid to take the chance.
Yeah, I really love that. And I was having a lunch with another colleague the other day, and we were talking about, in the healthcare industry, the only people that are getting rich is Washington D.C., the lobbyists and the insurance companies and their executives. Kind of,
Yep.
and doctors and patients are getting screwed over. Um, so, how can people find you and follow you and reach out to you and learn more about the work that you're doing?
So a good place to start is on rospharma.com. Aros Pharma is the name of the company where we're producing ResPen. On there, there's a contact us link. Also on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Our social media presence is really just beginning, because I didn't want to start social media until I knew we had a viable product, and that just came about this summer. So we're just kind of hitting the ground now and starting to share the news as we're working through the next step. So I would encourage people to reach out. In fact, if anyone in your audience is just interested in just general entrepreneurship, and wants to get an idea of how they can do something business wise and take the next steps, I'm happy to exchange emails and chat with whoever. I love the idea of helping each other out, and we're basically we're all colleagues, even if we haven't met each other. So let's work together.
Yeah, I really love that, and keep up the great work, and to your continued success in 2025.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate the time.